And this class is dedicated to environmental good news. And the reason I started that is that in the early years of teaching this class, many people said, this class seems a little doom and gloom. And is there any good news? Well, I think we could all use a bit of good news right now. But so I want to dedicate this class to yes. In terms of the environment, even though we think everything's going wrong and everything's going upside down and it's ending up on fire, there is some good news from all over the world. And I think it would be a good idea to dedicate a whole class to it. One of the most iconic pieces of good news, and one of the things that we collectively as a planet should be most proud of, is that due to our ongoing conservation efforts, some flagship endangered species are recovering. And in many cases, it's the most dramatic species on the planet. So for example, we'll start with tigers. Well, tiger populations were estimated to be 3,200 in 2010. That's the total global population of wild tigers. In 2016, the global population was sampled again, and this time it was estimated to be 3,890. And that is a 22% increase in tiger populations since they were last surveyed in 2010. This was the first time in over 100 years that tiger populations have increased all over the globe. Tigers have been persecuted for hundreds of years because they are gigantic, bloodthirsty murder beasts, and people and tigers tend to not mix because tigers eat them. People don't like being eaten, so tend to go and hunt the tigers. But in 2016, when they did that survey, for the first time in over 100 years, tiger populations actually increased. What was critical was that populations were rising in India, Nepal, Russia and Bhutan. The situation for tigers in Southeast Asia is still unclear. There is still deforestation and poaching issues, but the fact that tiger populations were seen to increase in size, especially in India, is incredibly important. India is one of the most rapidly developing nations in the world. It's a nation with a burgeoning middle class, and it's undergoing enormous amounts of economic growth. Its population is the second highest in the world, and despite all this population expansion, despite the fact it's got such a high population anyway, and despite the fact it's undergoing massive development, they still found room in that country to increase wild tiger populations. What this means is it's a demonstration that even on a massive subcontinental scale, humans can exist with large top predators that have the capable to do us harm. And the same story was true in Russia, Bhutan and Nepal. What this means is, for the first time, we've been really able to demonstrate that through collective efforts, setting aside conservation easements and other such factors, humans are able to coexist with large, dangerous apex predators. Other flagship species that have recovered are, most wonderfully, the giant panda, this happy little chap just here. So giant panda populations have increased by 17% between 2004 and 2014. Just have a think about what the giant panda is for a second. Giant panda is a large terrestrial mammal. It has a very narrow diet breadth, and it lives exclusively in China, the most populous nation on the planet. We managed to increase giant panda populations by 17% in 10 years, despite the fact they live in the world's most populous country, and a country that also has undergone enormous economic growth. And the reason this increase was achieved was because China instigated an extensive reforestation program to connect populations. The issue with giant panda conservation wasn't that giant pandas were persecuted and killed in the same way that dangerous animals like tigers are, or in the way that valuable animals like pangolins are. The reason panda populations went so low was because the ecosystems on which they depend, the bamboo forests, had been destroyed. China went through an extensive program of reforestation, and specifically reforestation with the intention of connecting together remnant patches of forests. And this reforestation program meant that the pandas had somewhere to go, they had somewhere to live. But China coupled this with excellent captive breeding and reintroduction programs. So this might be about the most fun job on the planet. This is looking after baby pandas. This one's not having a great day, but look how unbelievably cute these things are. China had realized that not only did they have to reforest, But they also had to have some pandas to put in those forests, and unfortunately panda reproductive rates are incredibly low. So China underwent an extensive captive breeding program where they worked out exactly how you breed pandas in captivity. After that, they went through an extensive reintroduction program. Not only did they breed these incredibly cute baby pandas, they taught them to be wild pandas. So now these young pandas, when they reach sort of juvenile stages, they're able to release them into the new environments they've created, and so as a result the wild population increases. What's most staggering about this story is that the status of giant pandas has been downgraded from endangered to vulnerable on the IUCN. What this means is, due to an extensive reforestation program, coupled with captive breeding and reintroduction, one of the most iconic endangered species on the planet, the giant panda, is no longer endangered. It's been downgraded to vulnerable. This has been sort of most staggering for the WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, because the giant panda was such an iconic symbol of endangered species, they used it as their logo. So the World Wildlife Fund, whose mission is to increase the success rate of endangered species in the world, their logo is no longer endangered because it was such a good success. So this is a great example of an incredibly populous nation, a nation that's undergoing rapid development, a success story where they managed to have the status of an iconic endangered species downgraded from endangered to vulnerable. And also, we've seen reductions in harvesting of at-risk species all across the planet. And one of the big success stories of this is actually shark fin soup. In one of the previous lectures, we talked about shark fin soup, and we talked about WildAid and their campaign to actually reduce consumption of shark fin soup, and it looks like it started to work. Shark fin soup sales nowadays are down by 70% compared to their historic maximum. That is a huge downward turn in the amount of this stuff being sold. And this change is due to a change in consumer attitude, not regulation. Some shark populations have, as a consequence, been seen to increase in China, but the overall decline is still present. But what's staggering is this value just here. The fact that due to a change in consumer attitude, shark fin soup sales are down by up to 70% compared to historic maximum. And if you know anything about what shark fin soup is used for, that becomes even more dramatic. Shark fin soup is not a day-to-day staple. It's not just a regular soup that you'd have at the beginning of every meal. It's a highly prized delicacy, and most specifically, it's a delicacy that is served as the first course at the meal to celebrate your wedding. So at your wedding reception, the first thing you serve to your guests is shark fin soup. And the reason you serve this is the idea is it grants the power and strength of shark onto the married couple, and it's essentially a blessing that will guide them in their future, and the marriage will become a success. It was symbolically a hugely important part of a Chinese wedding. However, due to an extensive advertising campaign, this attitude was changed, and people were willing to forego serving shark fin soup at their wedding despite its symbolic importance. So it's quite a big achievement. Some of the other things that we've seen in terms of reductions in harvesting of at-risk species, a great success story has been the whales. So since the end of commercial whaling in the 80s, many species of whale have recovered. Most staggering amongst these is actually the humpbacks. Humpbacks were very heavily persecuted during whaling to the point where they were nearly driven to extinction. However, humpbacks are now near pre-exploitation levels in many areas. What that means is the abundance of humpback whales in some locations is now as high as it was before we started commercial whaling. So these large marine mammals have been able to recover all over the world. And what's most staggering has been the rate of recovery. So humpbacks have got a very slow reproductive rate. On average, a single female can produce one calf every 2 to 3 years. However, despite this low reproductive rate, some populations of humpbacks have increased by 10% per year since they were protected. The reason they've been able to increase this rapidly is because the exploitation of humpbacks was literally targeted straight at humpbacks. They would take out these big factory ships and they would harpoon the humpbacks and harvest them out of the oceans. But the oceans in which they were harvested from weren't also exploited. So what that means is the humpback's food source, krill, plankton and herring, has remained present even though the humpbacks were gone. So when the humpbacks were then allowed to just repopulate themselves, bearing in mind there's no captive breeding program for humpbacks, when the humpbacks were left alone to repopulate, they found themselves in an abundance of food, and so as a result their populations are able to grow much faster than was initially predicted. We've also seen reductions of the way that these products are used. So for example, even though commercial whaling has been banned, there has been what we call scientific research taking place in Japan. And despite this continued whaling for scientific research, whale consumption has dropped in Japan. So what was most controversial about Japan's scientific research whaling program was that, first of all, they weren't producing any science from this scientific research, and also whale meat was turning up in supermarkets, food markets and restaurants all over Japan, even though commercial whaling was illegal. However, whale consumption has now dropped a lot in Japan, to the extent where 88% of the population never eat whale meat. This is down from less than 10% of the population never eating whale meat in the 80s. What this lack of demand for whale meat has meant is that the whole whaling industry in Japan, even though it's technically not an industry, it's a research project, it's not, it is an industry, the whole whaling industry in Japan is no longer profitable, and it must be taxpayer subsidized. This means that if it becomes so uneconomical, its days are basically numbered. If the government is having to continuously subsidize an industry just so that a very small minority of the population can get whale meat, that industry isn't going to survive. One of the ones that's most special towards my own heart has been the partial recovery of the reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is already starting to recover from its biggest die-off, which happened in 2015-2016. There have been subsequent incidences of Great Barrier Reef bleaching, but in some locations, the reef is actually showing signs of recovery. When we go on our field trip to Heron Island and the Southern Great Barrier Reef, you can actually see this for yourself. You can see some of the areas in which there was patches of coral bleaching, and in that bleaching you can see the little tiny baby coral growing on the dead older coral. The reef is starting to recover, and the reason it is able to recover is because of the geography of the Great Barrier Reef. So the Great Barrier Reef is nearly 1,500 miles long, and it stretches on a north-south axis. Most of the really nasty bleaching, which is shown up here, was actually in the northern sector. The reason for this is the northern sector of the Great Barrier Reef is the warmest part. However, down south in the southern sector, where it's a lot cooler, the bleaching wasn't nearly so extensive. Unfortunately, because of the way the currents move of the Great Barrier Reef, the way that coral reproduce is two ways. First of all, they bud, they split in half, and an individual turns into two offspring. But secondly, they do what's called broadcast spawning, like this. And in broadcast spawning, the individual corals release eggs and sperm into the water. Those eggs and sperm meet in the water column, and the fertilized egg floats off down the current, and wherever it lands, that's where a new baby coral starts. Now, the way that the currents hit Australia, they hit Australia in the south, and then they travel up the east coast and go up north towards the equator. What this means is that the healthier populations in the southern part of the Great Barrier Reef are able to do broadcast spawning. The eggs they produce then float up these currents and make their way north, and are able to actually provide new baby coral that can help repopulate the damaged north. So as a result, it's starting to recover, and this is great news. One of the really big ones that was a great global success was CFCs, because after maxing in September 2013, the ozone layer that surrounds the planet is actually healing. So we talked a little bit about CFCs in the pollution lecture. So CFCs, as we mentioned, were what were the propellant used inside aerosols. They were at their peak in the 80s because everybody needed hairspray to make these sort of fabulous barnets. But after it was discovered their damage they caused the ozone layer, CFCs were banned in the 2000s. However, these CFCs in the atmosphere, they took a while to degrade. So even though they were banned, as we talked about, they kept on damaging the ozone layer. However, nowadays, the ozone layer is healing. This image here shows it. The white line is where the hole in the ozone layer over Antarctica was at its peak. The hole is now this big. It's this indigo sector just here. So what we can see is already the size of the hole in the ozone layer has shrunk quite dramatically. And people are monitoring it, say the entire ozone layer should be fixed by 2075. And the story of CFCs, their ban and the subsequent impacts, is one of the things that I think holds out the most hope for other environmental issues. Because CFCs were what we call a non-point source pollutant. This means the pollution isn't just being generated by one single geographical place. And non-point source pollutants are often the hardest to stop because it's hard to target where the problem is actually coming from. If you want to stop pollution, it's much easier to stop pollution from one central gigantic factory than it is to stop pollution from 100,000 tiny little industrial activities that are taking place. Because if you just have one big factory, you can just target this factory, you guys, you're the problem, stop it. If it's in a much wider dispersed area, it becomes very hard to identify where the problem actually is. And CFCs were the extreme example of that. Because remember, CFCs were in aerosols. Every single aerosol anybody ever used in between the 1970s and 1980s contained CFCs. They were all over the globe and they were produced by thousands of different industries. But through a collective effort, we were able to get everybody to stop. And it's had this massive impact in the ozone layer has started to fix. So it's something we should hold out a lot of hope for. So just make sure everyone's keeping up to speed. We'll do a fake clicker question. So why did the ozone layer take so long to recover after the CFC ban? A, people in other countries continued to use it. B, there was so much in the atmosphere. C, CFCs are very stable in the atmosphere, therefore they take a long time to break down. D, the ozone layer was breaking down anyway. Just give you 10 seconds to go through that. And stop. Okay, the actual answer is C. Remember, the CFCs, the chlorofluorocarbons that were in these aerosols, were very, very stable in the atmosphere. And one single CFC molecule could break down thousands of ozone molecules. Therefore, because they were so stable, they took a very long time to break down. One other thing that we should be pretty proud about is recycling rates globally are absolutely skyrocketing. So this is for the USA alone. We've got time on the x-axis, and it's a little dated, but it shows the basic pattern. And on the y-axis, we've got millions of pounds collected. And this is of plastic. You can see that in the 1990, 30 years ago, we were getting less than 500 million pounds of plastic. We're now collecting and recycling more than 6 times that. So this is in the space of just 23 years. Recycling rates are now 6 times greater than they were in the 90s. So this is a huge improvement. Same can be seen in aluminium cans. However, aluminium cans has kind of peaked a little bit just because we've almost plateaued out. So aluminium can recycling started in 1972 and it was less than about 15%. By the sort of early 2010s, it was up to 67%. So again, an increase of about 4 to 5 times in the space of just a little over about 30 years. Aluminium cans are an excellent product to recycle because they are what's called lossless recycling. So the aluminium that's inside this can, you can just melt it down, recycle it, use it again, and it doesn't lose any quality at all. The quality of the can the second time is just as good as it was the first time. What that means is you can actually recycle cans multiple times, and it's now much cheaper to recycle aluminium cans than it is to go and collect new aluminium out of the earth itself. What this means is that the aluminium cans that you use today have probably been recycled tens, if not hundreds of times already, and the turnaround time for aluminium can recycling is faster than any other form of recycling. The process is very energy efficient and can be done very quickly. One of the really big success stories from the USA and Europe is actually acid rain. We talked a little bit about acid rain a couple of lectures ago, but I want to talk now about its success. So in the 70s and 80s, European and East North American acid rain was so bad that it could kill forests. So if you look through the Czech Republic, parts of Germany, Sweden, Pennsylvania, you'd see forests that looked a bit like this. An entire stand of dead trees. These haven't been killed in a forest fire, they've got no flame marks on them. These trees were killed directly by acid rain. The acid rain fell into the forests, was absorbed by the soils, it then gets absorbed by the trees themselves, and it leads to their mortality. This was a huge problem in both Europe and East North America. We'd end up with images that look a bit like this. So this one down at the bottom right, remember acid rain is a point source pollution. So you have sulfur and nitrous oxides being produced by industrial activities. These are then released into the atmosphere and they fall as rain with decreasing distance away from the point source itself. This image here shows basically the boundary. So on this section here, the acid rain was so bad it was able to kill the forests. In this section it's clearly weakened them. Here we're far enough away that they can still survive. You can actually see this is what it looks like on the margin, so pinpoint trees that have been killed off by acid rain. You can see there's just the degradation everywhere. However, there were massive restrictions on emissions of sulfur in North America and Europe, and they have resulted in significant reductions in the acidity of precipitation. Because of this reduction in acidity, forests are recovering. So if we look here, what was most staggering about this was the speed with which it was done. So we look specifically in this case at Sweden. Sweden was a real flashpoint for this. Sweden got absolutely hammered by acid rain. And in 1995, this is the amount of sulfur dioxide being released into the air, partially through industrial processes, some through transport and from other combustion. In 1995, they set a target for 2010 to say we need to reduce our sulfur dioxide emissions to this level here by 2010 in order to save the forests. They started this in 1995. By the year 2000, they'd already achieved their target. So they were able to achieve that target of reduced emissions 10 years early. They thought it was going to take 15 years, they did it in 5. Because it was such an important event, it was done so rapidly. Same thing was seen in the United Kingdom. So this is 1970s. Again, we're looking at sulfur dioxide emissions. Here's what it is in 1970s. Here's what it is already all the way down by 2003. It started off over 6 million tonnes being produced in the 1970s. By 2003, it was down to less than 1 million tonnes. So they'd reduced their emissions of sulfur dioxide by 6 times. That is a massive reduction in CO2, in sulfur dioxide emissions, and it was achieved in just over 30 years. And this was done at the same time as industrial manufacture in the UK increased. Here's what we see in the US, a big decline of both nitrogen oxides and sulfur dioxides. So in the US and in Europe, we've seen these dramatic declines in nitrous oxide and sulfur dioxide. Because of these reductions in emissions, we're seeing changes in precipitation acidity. So on this map here, we have the annual pH precipitation weighted by volume in 1994. So this is obviously the USA. Remember, pH, the lower it is, the more acidic it is. And we can see in this sector here, the sort of northeast and especially the Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania, where we produce a lot of steel, New York, all that sort of area. You've got this big, huge hotspot of low pH, so acid rain, being caused by this being a hotspot for the emittance of sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxide. If you look at what it was in 2008, yes, we still have this hotspot, but the magnitude has gone down an awful lot, and the area has gone down an awful lot. At this point, remember, this hotspot is reaching all the way down into the southern states. It's almost completely gone 14 years later. So generally we're seeing that changes in industrial practices, industrial manufacture hasn't gone down, but changes in practices aiming to reduce emissions is resulting in this dramatic drop in acid rain. Because of this, we're seeing recovery of lakes and forests in northeast USA and Canada. Now if you go out to northeast, this is the Appalachians, like northeast USA and Canada, we've got lots of lovely healthy green trees, everything good and growing, nice and recovering, and a nice healthy lake. This is what it looked like in the 80s, lots and lots of dead trees, only a minority of trees still surviving. Due to the changes that we implemented, forests in Appalachia and the forests on there have been able to recover. One of the most dramatic ones, and something to fix on that we have, and something to talk about that we brought up in the last lecture, was how human population growth might be the biggest environmental issue facing the planet. The reason for this is because if you've got more people, they automatically just require more resources, takes more food to feed them. That's going to have an impact on the entire world. However, the global population rate is slowing. So if we look at the growth rate in percentage, the globe, when its records first really started taking up in the 50s, the global population that was here, it showed an increase. It's now actually declining. All over the world, the number of people being produced is declining. And one of the most dramatic of this is birth rates are going down in the world's most polluting nations. So the world's most polluting areas are the USA, the European Union, and China. In all of these areas, the number of children born per female is going down. Remember, you need 2.1 births per female in order to maintain a stable population. In the USA, it's now dropped so that it's 1.88 births per female, so that's below replacement. In the EU, it's dropped even more dramatically, and it's a 1.6 births per female. And in China, it's dropped to 1.66 births per female. Of all of these, I think the most striking is the EU, the European Union. Remember, we talked about it last time, China has implemented the one-child policy. So China implemented a policy specifically targeted at reducing population growth. It was incredibly controversial, it led to a lot of problems, and it's now actually been repealed. But even with that policy in place, China has had a birth rate of 1.66 births per female. By contrast, the European Union has not had any policies to try and limit population growth rates, apart from wide accessibility to contraception. They've never restricted how many children you can have, there's never been a top-down approach, and there's never been excessive government interference in reproduction. However, the EU has managed to have a lower birth rate than China. Also, per capita CO2 emissions are going down in parts of the developed world. So these data are a little bit out of date, but it's the most recent ones I could find. So in 2000, this shows the number of tons of CO2 produced per person per year. In the USA, in the year 2000, every person produced 20.2 tons of CO2 just during their day-to-day activities and every year. 13 years later, in 2013, that value had dropped to 16.3. So that is a drop of basically 20%. A 20% drop in per capita CO2 emissions per person. In Europe, it was slightly larger. So in Europe, the average European generated 9.2 tons of CO2 in the year 2000. 2013, that value had dropped to 7.1. That's a drop of about 25%, so about a quarter. So every person in Europe is producing 1/4 less CO2 than they were in the year 2000. And that's actually dropped even more in the EU nowadays. This is due to increased efficiency and changes in people's lifestyles. And in terms of per capita CO2 emissions, the USA is no longer number one. The USA has always had this history of being the number one producer of pollutants and the number one in terms of per capita and the number one per capita CO2 emitter. It isn't anymore. Can you guess what it is? Don't know if anyone's even close, but the USA is now 12th. There's an awful lot of nations all over the world, especially in the Middle East, that produce a lot more pollution per capita than we do. So, why are per capita emissions lower now than historically? A, there are fewer people now. B, increased efficiency generally. C, increased use of renewables. D, both increased use of renewables and increased efficiency generally. Just give you 10 seconds on that. Okay, and stop. The answer is both increased use of renewables and increased efficiency generally. Although there are slightly fewer people now, remember in this we're talking about per capita emissions. And per capita means the amount produced by each person. Okay? One of the big things we've seen in the last few years is a dramatic increase in renewable energy. So on here, on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, we have installed renewable power capacity. And this here is in the USA. What we can see is since 2001 to 2014, we've had this dramatic increase in the power capacity of renewable energy, going from less than 20 gigawatts in 2001 to over 120, about 130 gigawatts in 2014. So that is a very dramatic increase. It's about 8 times more here than we have here. And this increase in renewable energy is quite impressive in the USA, but in other parts of the world, it's absolutely staggering. So one country that's very close to my heart is Costa Rica. I've done a lot of field work in Costa Rica. I usually visit Costa Rica for about a month every year. We live out in the forests. Here's Hamel running around with a baby boa constrictor. We hike up into the cloud forests and we do a whole bunch of research out there looking at the different insects that exist in Costa Rica. And Costa Rica is a relatively small country. Its population is about 4.5 million people. But Costa Rica is a very, very green-focused nation. And they managed to achieve this very, very well indeed. So in 2014, 99% of the electricity used in Costa Rica was renewable. 99%. They've maintained that level of high renewable electricity since 2014. And in 2013, 99% again was renewable. But most dramatically, in 2019, over 300 consecutive days were run on 100% renewable electricity. Costa Rica does still have some gas plants and that are burning fossil fuels to produce electricity, but in 2009 they did not turn on those gas plants for over 300 consecutive days. The nation ran ran entirely on renewable energy, solar, wind, hydropower. One of the things that's really dramatic as well to couple with this is that Costa Rica is now focusing on moving away from gas-powered engines into electric-powered engines and is investing in that very, very heavily because they've now worked out there's nowhere else they can go in terms of their production of electricity to make it greener. If you're at 99% and you're at 100% for over 300 days, you can't actually make your electricity production any greener. You have to focus on your other issues, and their most pressing issue that they've decided now is transport. So many of even the tourist buses that drive people around in Costa Rica are now turning electric. But it's not limited just to these small nations. So if we look at one of the nations in Europe, Germany. So Germany, the population of Germany is about 80 million people. It's one of the most populous nations in Europe. It's also the industrial powerhouse of Europe. Germany is by far the biggest economy in Europe. It's famous for producing an awful lot of consumer goods, most recognizable of which are big, gigantic saloon cars. Germany is the #1 producer of sports saloon or sports sedan cars. These are big, enormous, powerful, shouty cars that go around corners sideways and make a lot of noise, and smoke comes off the tyres and things like that. That's what Germany's famous for, its giant Autobahn destroyers. But in Germany in 2018, 40% of their electricity was renewable. This was up from 6.3% in 2000. And critically, 2018 was the first year where Germany generated more electricity from renewable sources than from coal. So a massive industrialized nation that sits on huge beds of coal and had let its economy boom due to the burning of coal, had managed to switch so that more of its electricity was renewable than it was from coal. And most stunning of this of all is BMW's Leipzig plant. So the plant, the place where they make these gigantic shouty cars that go around corners sideways, that BMW Leipzig plant is self-sufficient and runs on 100% renewable energy. So the factory where they make these things runs entirely on solar power that it generates itself. So it's a pretty staggering achievement. And globally, all over the world, the capacity, the amount of electricity we can produce from renewable energy is now greater than coal. One of the biggest areas of this is solar. Solar is very appealing to a lot of people, and actually very appealing to people out here in the Western US than many other forms of renewable energy, because solar energy can be totally independent. You can install your own solar panels on the roof of your house and make your house independent from the electricity that comes in on the grid. What that means is it taps into that Western spirit of independence, and it also means when they're announcing power cuts and things like that, you don't have to worry in the slightest. And although we now have a greater capacity for solar than for coal, due to changing supply, globally coal still does provide more energy on average, so about 40% versus 23% over here in the US. But one thing we need to think about when looking at the expansion of renewable energy is the undisputable leader in renewable energy expansion on this planet is, have a guess, it's China. China is the #1 place for renewable energy expansion in the world. Although they aren't a big industrialized nation, they are really investing heavily in renewable energy. One of the things that was something to be quite chipper about if you're a little bit of a petrol head is that the progress in efficiency in cars. Because modern cars are now more efficient and simultaneously much more powerful. So, if we have a look at this thing, for example, a classic icon of American motoring, the Ford Mustang. So 1965 was the first year that Ford released the V8 Mustang. Prior to this, you get a V6 and a 4-banger, but this was the first year they brought out the big V8, the iconic V8 Mustang. This car, in 1965, chucked out 210 brake horsepower and did only 10 to 13 miles per gallon. So look at this horsepower value and look at the miles per gallon. If you take the modern equivalent, the 2020, the V8 model, not the little one, the big one, the max power coming out of this is 460 brake horsepower, which means it's more than double what the 1960s model was. But in addition, it does 16 to 25 miles to the gallon. So its fuel efficiency is nearly double what the old one is as well. So we've gone, in the space of 60 years, from going from a car that now has double the horsepower and double the fuel economy simultaneously. But it's not just that. Let's have a look at some of the other models from the 60s. So, if you look at the 1965 base model, so this was objectively a cool car. You would think of this as a sports car. It was for tearing around and, doing crazy stuff with. 1965, the base model Mustang came with a 2.8 litre engine, a max power of 105 brake horsepower, miles per gallon 18 to 28. The year after, they upgraded it a bit, and so the 1966 model, 3.3 litre, max power 120 brake horsepower, 14 to 22 miles per gallon. So this is still objectively a cool car. It's a rear-engined, high-performance sports car. However, if you compare it to the modern day, it actually has less power than your grandmother's Toyota Corolla. So the 2019 Corolla has more horsepower than a sports car from the 60s, and it gets nearly double the fuel economy at the same time. So we are producing cars nowadays that are not only more powerful, but also better fuel economy. However, when we're talking about increased fuel economy in cars and increased efficiency, historically, some European cars had absolutely amazing fuel economy, such as, behold, the mighty Peugeot 106. I actually had one of these when I was about your age. I had a 1993 model. It had a 1.5 litre diesel engine, and I had this thing in 1998. When I owned it, this car in the late 90s was getting 50 to 65 miles to the gallon. That's better than a modern Prius that you'd buy today. So this little car, that's nearly 30 years old, was able to get better fuel economy than a modern Prius. However, that being said, it did have only 58 horsepower, and 0 to 60 took about 15.3 seconds, which is slower than a delivery van nowadays. So it wasn't the fastest thing in the world. But look at it. It was absolutely heroic. I didn't quite fit in it, but it was great. To the point that some British cars were a little bit silly. So if anyone's ever seen a TV show called Top Gear, especially the older versions of it, they did a feature on this thing once. This is a car known as the Peel P50. It is British made. It was made from 1962 to 1965. It had a 49cc engine. That's the same as what you get in a moped. Top speed of just under 40 miles an hour. But this little tiny city car would do nearly 120 miles to the gallon. So that is an incredible fuel economy. To its credit, it is stretching the word car a bit thin. There are some that wouldn't really consider this a car at all. But interestingly, you can actually buy one of these today because they started production again in 2012. So we did get a bit silly in Europe, but fuel economy was good. One of the things that I really want to talk about that's the beginnings of a summation of this has been flat carbon emissions. So one of the biggest problems that we face that generates global warming, it also generates climate change generally, and it generates oceanification, has been the emission of CO2. However, global carbon emissions did not increase at all in the years 2014 to 2017. However, critically, during that same period, economic growth across the planet increased by 3%. So in 3 years, when we did not increase the amount of CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, we also increased economic growth by 3%. And if you were able to get a 3% increase in terms of interest in your bank account, you would be overjoyed. And in addition, crucially to this, emissions were actually reduced in some countries such as China. China CO2 emissions dropped 1.6% between 2014 and 2016, but the economy grew by 6.7%. And in the USA, CO2 went down by 3% and the economy went up by 1.6%. So we're starting to see this situation where CO2 emissions go down at the same time as the economy is going up. And what this means is carbon and economic growth is not linked. we've started to see a decoupling between the ability of nations to grow their economies and the necessity to produce carbon dioxide. Because since 2000, a total of 21 nations have simultaneously increased economic growth while decreasing CO2. And some of these are quite dramatic. So for example, Ireland, since 2000, its GDP, or its economy, has grown by nearly 50%. However, its CO2 productions have gone down by 16%. The way that Ireland has achieved this is by pivoting its economy. Ireland, just before the 2000s, was very much still an agricultural society. It was, the majority of the population was rural and lived and worked on farms. However, in the early 2000s, there was something called the Celtic Tiger, where Ireland repivoted what it wanted its country to be, and it moved away from being a rural agricultural nation to the tech hub of Europe. So nowadays, an awful lot of big tech companies, companies like Dell, Adobe, have their European headquarters in Ireland. This has meant the population has moved away from high polluting industries into computing and things like that. That's allowed them to massively increase their gross domestic product while also decreasing their CO2 emissions. However, Ireland wasn't the biggest. If you look at the Ukraine has had its GDP increase by 50% since 2000, and its CO2 emissions have dropped by 30%. This is for similar reasons to what happened in Ireland, but not quite the same. It was due to a repositioning of what Ukraine wanted itself to be. Historically, Ukraine was the manufacturing capital of the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union still existed, an awful lot of the machinery, an awful lot of the stuff that went on like that was done in what is now Eastern Europe, in places like the Ukraine. The Ukraine moved away from those industries and again moved heavily into tech and away from heavily polluting industries. As a result, their GDP went up and their CO2 went down. But they're not the most dramatic. The biggest was the nation of Slovakia, another Eastern European nation that again was a Soviet industrial powerhouse. And Slovakia has increased its GDP since the year 2000 by 75%, while at the same time reducing its carbon emissions by 22%. So its GDP has sort of nearly doubled, while its CO2 has dropped by more than a fifth. And what this has implications for global emissions and economic consequences. Because if we look at some sort of right-wing agencies that are pushing for have an anti-climate change stance, CO2 is fine, etc., places like Prager University, the Climate Depot, and even Fox News, the big argument coming out of these agencies is said that we can't reduce CO2 because it hurts businesses. This idea that if we start taking measures to reduce our CO2 emissions, it's going to have negative economic consequences, businesses are going to suffer, and our quality of life will go down. However, the story that we see from nations especially like Ireland, Slovakia, and the Ukraine, and even to a small extent the US and China, demonstrates we can reduce CO2 and also increase economic growth. So what we can do is identify a decoupling of growth and CO2 emissions. So this means some of these arguments, such as given by a certain somebody, the concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Well, what we actually see from history, and this decoupling of growth and CO2, means that the argument of green taping kills businesses. Green taping is a slang word for putting excessive regulation in the way of businesses, so they have to reduce their CO2 emissions. This argument that green taping kills businesses is suddenly undermined. We've shown that for many nations, you can increase economic growth while also reducing CO2. And if we look specifically at China, which is the largest manufacturer on the planet, China is the current leader in renewable development, but also the world's largest manufacturer. And China has gone mad for solar. So China installed 60 gigawatts of solar in 2017 alone. It installed 48 gigawatts of solar in 2016. China is very heavily moving away from coal and moving into solar. And just to put into perspective these numbers of how much 60 gigawatts is, the total USA solar capacity is 50 gigawatts. So what this means is, in 2017, China installed more solar than was present in the USA at all, and they installed it in 1 year. And they did pretty much the same thing the year before as well. So, given all this now, how do I feel about the state of the world? A, everything's just fine, we as people haven't impacted the planet. B, everything's not perfect, we've damaged it a bit, but it's not an issue. C, we have badly damaged the planet, but with a few small changes, everything will be okay. Or D, we need to make serious changes to try and undo the damage we've done. It's perhaps possible, but difficult. E, we're all screwed. And I want you to answer this independent of the current corona situation. Okay, that was the last slide of this class. It's been a pleasure to teach you, and I hope we can catch up soon.